Wonderful, it just about worked. Please take your seats, because we're now going to have a very interesting discussion after what has been an extremely interesting day about the future of Europe. Now, my name's Gillian Tett. I'm a journalist with the Financial Times. As you can hear, I'm British, and for someone coming from the UK these days, talking about Europe is a topic which creates very mixed emotions. I'm part of the generation that grew up assuming that we were part of the European Union, very excited about being part of Europe, and has now seen events take a very different turn in the last 2 years. And in many ways, it's very hard to sound wildly optimistic about Europe today. Opinions are very split. We had a very split set of views expressed earlier this morning when we heard from President Poroshenko saying that he was optimistic, and then we heard from Larry Summers saying that he was pessimistic about the future of Europe. So what we're going to discuss now is whether there are reasons to feel optimistic or reasons to feel pessimistic. And we have a fantastic group of people to help us do that. I would ask you all, please, to be quiet for a moment so that I can introduce them properly and you can appreciate the range of experience and wisdom and views we have to bring on this question. We have Valdis Dombrovskis, a man who barely needs any introduction, who is the Vice President of the European Union in charge of the Euro, who's going to be talking to us about his views about monetary integration. We have Franco Frattini, the former Foreign Minister of Italy, who's going to be talking about the Italian perspective. And then we have Manuel Valls, the former Prime Minister of France, who will be presenting his perspective. And at the end, I have a co-moderator, Neil Ferguson, who will be hopefully challenging me, challenging all of us, and presenting a slightly different view on where Europe is going. But before I do that, before I hand over to Mr. Dombrovskis, I want to quickly start with a question to you all, to make sure that you're listening, that you're awake, and that you're actually engaged. And perhaps you should all take a glass of wine before I ask you this question, because I'm going to ask you all to vote. I'd like to ask you to vote on 2 questions. Firstly, have we today, in 2018, seen the peak of populism yet in Europe? Or are we going to see Europe become more populist in the future? That's going to be the first question. The second question is Europe going to be stronger in 5 years' time or weaker? Do we have reasons to be optimistic or pessimistic? So let's start with the first question. Let's check you're all awake. Who thinks that populism is going to increase in the coming years? Okay. Who thinks that populism is going to decrease? Okay. And a lot of you are either undecided or too busy talking to your neighbors or too bored by the question. Second question. Who thinks that Europe is going to be stronger as a political unit in 5 years' time? And who thinks that it will be weaker? Okay, well, most people haven't yet voted, but I'd say there's a narrow balance of people who think it will be weaker and more populist. So, Mr. Dombrovskis, tell us why that is not a reason for pessimism.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's an honor for me to address you in a Yalta conference today. And I would like to start with a simple fact. Over 2/3 of the EU citizens consider EU membership to be a good thing for their country. And this is the highest share since 1983. And I started with this from the Eurobarometer survey of this spring because some would like us to believe that EU is in a danger of disintegration. But it's not true, so we have to set the record straight and take pride on our success. And for decades, the EU has kept proving the pessimists wrong in Europe, despite many challenges it had faced. And also because today EU's economy is growing in a sixth consecutive year. Employment is at record high levels. And one reason for this success is that Europe is built on strong principles. It's built on principles of cooperation and solidarity, but also individual responsibility of the EU member states. And the same goes for euro. Today, this is a currency used by 19 EU member states, over 340 million people. It offered monetary stability to its members. It's made easier to do business and travel. But it also requires continued efforts to build a competitive and resilient economies in all euro area countries. And this is exactly what we had been doing. For years, we had focused on boosting investment, implementing structural reforms, and maintaining sound fiscal policies. And we see the economic results, which I already mentioned. But of course, there is more to do. In today's uncertain global climate, we need resilient economies to withstand even major economic shocks. And we need to strengthen the international role of the Europe, which is an asset for building Europe's future. And we must continue our efforts to complete the economic and monetary union. So I think we have a strong basis, and we are working to make Europe even stronger. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I please ask everyone in the room to just halt their conversation for the moment, out of respect for the speakers. We will be finished in about an hour's time. So just pause your conversation, and so we can actually have a proper discussion during dinner, and then we'll have plenty of chance to chat to your neighbours afterwards. So,
Gillian, before we go on, can I just point out that you all listened to the Americans. You all listened to the Americans at lunchtime. So you had better listen to the Europeans at dinner time, or we shall be very offended.
Thank you, Neil. Neil and I are going to play a kind of Richard and Judy, or Punch and Judy show here to try and keep everyone in line. Monsieur Val.
Je vais le faire en français. Oui, je vais le faire en français.
If everyone can please get their translation device, because Monsieur Val is going to speak in French. On va parler en français. Yeah.
Parler de l'Europe dans cette salle à manger donne presque le sentiment, ou me donne le sentiment, avec les bruits de fourchettes,
the feeling when I hear the clinking of the pottery that I'm on Titanic. So all the people who can witness sinking of Titanic and the orchestra playing to the sinking. I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I think that Europe is one of the biggest successes, one of the most beautiful things that ever happened in modern times, reconciling Germany and France, leading to peace and development. The European countries, Western European countries, Southern European countries, Eastern European countries coming out of their dictatorial past and stepping on the path of democracy and development instead. As Vice President of the Euro Social Dialogue rightly mentioned, the situation is not that bad. The reforms are ongoing. Euro is quite stable as a currency. And I think that Europe, or the EU to be exact, can lose their positions or disappear from the stage of history. Brexit was a historical mistake, or historic mistake for that matter, and that can be also caused by certain surges of populism and demagoguery even that play on the Islamophobia and the the European anxieties. The financial crisis led to impoverishment of the middle class and enrichment of the elite. You can see some global movements, not just about the populist parties, but also a change of setting politically, and the setting that used to function steadily for a long time and now seem to be disoriented. In this situation, I think every state has problems of their own, and that includes development of Europe. Я можу сказати, що I can say that if there is no political will inside the EU, if there is no togetherness of the new forces coming together for the sake of European economic development, but also European values against populism, because we see populists mushrooming everywhere, Europe will be devastated, but it seems to me that there is an opportunity now, clearly, when we see that President Trump does not see his priorities in Europe. Particularly, we can see this trade war raging. European has a window of opportunities for economy, strategic development, defense and security, aimed at the eastern border and the southern border, but in Kiev I would like to emphasize the eastern trajectory. And I would like to say that we need to keep our finger on the pulse of history and politics. And in the European Union we have a decline in birth rate, aging of the population, and hence a demographic crisis. Under such circumstances, we can single out the important topics on the agenda of Europe.
Thank you, Mr. Valls. Before I turn to Mr. Frantini, I want to quickly ask, you come from perhaps the one country which has had a big anti-establishment vote, anti-establishment election, which has produced a centrist leader who's quite technocratic, Monsieur Macron. When I go around England or Italy or places like that, I often hear people say, how can we clone Monsieur Macron? How can we repeat that elsewhere? What do you think that France did? How did you have an election which produced a centrist leader rather than another populist one? And then I'm going to turn to Italy because that question is very relevant for Italy.
Well, first of all, I will be not talking about...
Let's ask Italy first and then France.
What?
Yes, please. I'd like to hear from both of you, actually, that question, but...
Non, je crois que c'est très important d'écouter un grand dirigeant italien.
I think that to answer your question, I have to say the following. The chance is not very big. It's slim, rather slim. A good leader and a good electoral system. That's the recipe. But after the first tour of the French election, practically 50% of the voters voted against. Monsieur Macron was elected in the second round, competing with the extreme right parties. And his party won in the national election stage. He is personally talented. He worked with the youth
assumer pleinement ses convictions
and we have to understand
qui expliquent cela. Et je rajouterai enfin un élément,
these ideas.
nous en parlions juste avant de commencer
They are
cette
completely
discussion,
European.
c'est que lui portait un discours aussi contre les partis, contre l'establishment,
It was also
contre les partis traditionnels qui avaient gouverné le pays
anti-establishment
au cours des dernières décennies,
against traditional
à droite
parties,
républicaine comme le Parti socialiste. Mais ça n'était
arguing
pas un
against
populisme,
Republicans and
c'était une manière de
socialists, but
changer,
that
de
wasn't
renverser. Les
populist.
Français ont eu l'opportunité de changer le système
On his
politique
part, that was a way to
avec un
change the
leader
French
centriste,
people and the political
jeune,
party
progressiste
with a
et
centrist
européen.
leader in
Sans doute, s'il n'y
place,
avait pas eu cette
young,
option,
progressive
alors à
and
ce moment-là,
European.
peut-être que la France
And
aurait
without
pu
such
succomber,
merits,
elle aussi, dans le populisme,
he would
même
not
si ce
have
système
been
électoral et ses
able
ingrédients,
to stop
heureusement, sa
sliding
capacité à lutter contre le
France
racisme,
from sliding into
l'antisémitisme, la
deep
violence et le
populism.
populisme,
Fortunately,
nous aurait peut-être empêché
his
cela.
ability
Mais voilà
to
les raisons pour
fight
lesquelles
racism
il y a
and
eu
populism
cette situation. Ça n'est pas dû
produced that
uniquement au
effect
talent des Français,
and
même
stopped
s'il y
the
a sans doute un peu
sliding
de cela.
into the pit of extreme rightism.
Well,
And that's
thank you.
has to be put to his credit.
I'm very interested to hear Signor Frattini's views on this, because we're talking about the future of Europe. In many ways, Italy is seen as one of the greatest risks in terms of the economic situation and also the rising populism and the political volatility. So I'm curious, from an Italian perspective, where you think Europe is going, but also, could Italy ever produce its own Italian Macron?
Well, first of all, I start from the end. I'm still one of those who believe that Europe has a future, and Europe is still the best possible construction for me as Italian, coming from old Europe, from those coming from the new Europe, and for those coming from neighbor countries that would like to get closer and closer to Europe, as it is the case of Ukraine. Europe is still the best possible construction. So this is my conclusion. But if you want to defend a construction, if you want to defend a model, you should be able to understand your past mistakes. Because what happened in Italy did not happen by case. It was consequence of political events, of political trends, and feelings of the Italian population that unfortunately have been underestimated. This is the situation. So while saying Europe as a future, I have in mind three possible options for the future of Europe, because one thing is to say, okay, Europe will be there in the 5, 10, 15 years, but what kind of Europe will be there? First option, Europe is continuing to act as today. Nothing changes. This is a possible option one. A second option, Europe is able to launch some visionary reform strategies. For example, strengthening the political dimension of Europe, not only the also important economic and banking dimension of European Union. I have in mind more European integration in the field of security and defense policies, or maybe some common guidelines on foreign policy, all which is related to political dimension of European integration. And option number three is that the tendency that we have today of member states trying to reduce the responsibilities of European Commission, moving towards some more intergovernmental models, will continue. This is the option three. Europe remains as it is. Europe has a vision to strengthen political integration. Europe is trapped in the vicious circle and of course I don't like that kind of model, where the European Commission is diminished in its responsibility to lead on some extremely important dossier. I make just one example. In the Lisbon Treaty is said very clearly that that migration should be a European common policy. Now, only after years and years of critics of different points of view, Southern Europe, Italy and others, claiming more Europe, more solidarity, only now European Commission rightly is about to present some common initiatives like European United Border Guard Corps, for example. But everything is related to common policies is subject to some boycott from the European Council, from the heads of state and government. They want to keep the power, they want to reduce the margins of maneuvers of European Commission. This could be the option 3. In this option 3, there could be two-speed Europe, which is the model I prefer, by far the number 2 option. So Europe having the courage to launch a visionary strategy on more political integration. What Manuel just said is something I share completely. To this end, we badly need political leadership. If you want to have an European Union most proactive, more proactive on the global scene, you have to have political leadership supporting. Now we have the situation where what is good is because of the merits of the given national state. What is going wrong is because of the European institution. So that's why it's absolutely unfair. But this is the reality, right. And this is what has led to the result in Italy that I have to respect because it's a result of democratic vote. Maybe later I will tell you something more about the Italian situation.
So a lack of political leadership. Yeah. I mean, do any of you see any chance of that European leadership coming soon? I mean, Neil, you're listening to this. I'm wondering whether Monsieur Val or Mr. Dombrovskis.
Well, I am fascinated that a Ukrainian or predominantly Ukrainian audience should pay so little attention to what is being discussed on this platform. Because as I understand it, Ukraine aspires to join the European Union and not the United States of America. And if you are serious about ultimately joining the European Union, then you should listen very carefully to the conversation that we are having. Because you have heard from 3 different authoritative voices that the European Union is working, that the euro is working, and that the solution to Europe's problems is more integration in different domains such as security. And I think it is my unhappy task as a somewhat Eurosceptically inclined Briton to cast doubt on this vision and to suggest to you that this might not happen. Let's consider the record of the European institutions over the past 10 years. Even if you were a proponent of monetary union, which I was not, you could not say that Europe handled the financial crisis brilliantly well. And even if you are a proponent of a common European security policy, you could not say that Europe handled the Arab revolutions terribly well. And even if you are a proponent of a common policy on free movement of people, you could not say that Europe handled the great migration crisis very well. And if you want to understand why the United Kingdom is voting to leave the European Union, or has voted to leave the European Union, a large part of the answer lies in those failures, which I think ultimately persuaded British voters that the project of European integration was doomed. And I certainly think you as Ukrainians should be a lot more skeptical than President Poroshenko was this morning about the viability of a project that has been failing on all the major challenges that it has confronted for the last 10 years. There are currently 6 governments in Europe with populist elements in them, and one of them is Italy. But there are 11 populist parties in Europe with 20% or more popular support. So the idea that populism is about to go away seems highly unlikely. My question for our 3 representatives of the EU is, how do you propose to stop the populist wave in the European elections next year? Because that seems to pose the most direct challenge to your vision of further integration. If the populists are successful next year, there will be no further integration, and the only question will become, can Europe stay in the same place, or will it slowly begin to fall apart?
So who wants to go first? Maybe Mr. Dombrovskis.
Well, yes. So on this question, and actually I would say the first part of the more statement and second part of question were actually linked. So in the first part, you basically looked back at the last 10 years and challenged Europe's track record. Well, I was introduced as being, among other things, responsible for Euro, so probably I'll concentrate on that part, because indeed, this year is 10 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers and global financial and economical crisis, and Europe had to deal with this. And I would argue that Europe dealt with this. First, it was becoming clear that there are countries in EU which needs financial assistance. And Europe reacted to this. Europe provided ad hoc programs to the number of countries, including the country I know best, Latvia. And Europe gradually set more permanent structure, and currently it has European Stability Mechanism to support Euro area countries in difficulties, and actually just last month, the last country, Greece, left the program, and all 28 EU member states are back to the economic growth. Then we must remember, crisis started as a financial crisis in the banking system. So what we did, we created banking union with single rule book, single supervision, single resolution mechanisms, and now are dealing with those issues in much more hands-on way. Then there was question of fiscal and macroeconomic policies of different member states, because it must be admitted that member states which run in difficulties had some reasons why exactly those member states had difficulties. That's why we strengthened fiscal and macroeconomic surveillance of EU member states, what's called European semester, and it also seems to be bringing results. We see both budget deficits and public debts in member states clearly going down. So I would say, if we now look at what Europe did to overcome global financial and economical crisis, we have done quite a lot. It's not over. We still need to complete the economic and monetary union. We still need capital markets union. There's more things to do. And actually, the second part of populism is linked with your first part, because yes, after having gone through the major crisis, we are having some kind of a populist backslash. And I think one of the ways to deal with this is to ensure that benefits of economic growth, which we see macroeconomically, are actually felt by all European citizens. So we need to concentrate on policies to reduce income inequality, to ensure income growth to all parts of the population. And current macroeconomic developments actually allows us to concentrate on this and to make sure that actually citizens see benefits of Europe and see benefits of economic growth in European member states.
Well, that sounds very worthy as a goal. Is it workable?
Well, I would like to hear from Franco Frattini, because I was in Italy last week and I heard your Interior Minister, Matteo Salvini. And I thought, as I listened to him, here is the next European crisis right in front of me, because the new government in Italy is clearly relaxing fiscal policy. It is undoing structural reform. It does not have a stable debt to GDP ratio. It has an excessively high one. And I left Italy thinking that the Italian government is walking a tightrope. And if it were to fall off the tightrope, if it were to lose the confidence of financial markets, it would present the European Union and the European Central Bank with a challenge far more severe than the Greek crisis, because the scale would be unmanageably large. In some ways, Italy is not only too big to fail, it's too big to bail. And I wonder if I'm right, Franco, to worry about Italy's fiscal stability as a consequence of its political instability.
Well, so far, I cannot speak on behalf of the Italian government for sure, nor I'm here to defend the government of my country. I say two things. One, answer to your very interesting question. Secondly, what I would say to persuade those like you that have doubts that Europe deserves to be still an attractive construction. First point, on fiscal stability, I'm absolutely sure that despite all the tactics of those weeks at the end, while presenting the Italian budget law for 2019, the government of Italy will keep all the points made by European Union in line perfectly, including deficit, GDP 3%, including the path towards reducing Italian public debt. I have no doubts that the Minister of Finance of Italy, who is perfectly aware of the potential consequences of Italy losing confidence to the, I would say, international financial community, the minister is perfectly aware of all of this, and he will have full support of the ruling majority. By the way, consider that we have now not at all instability. The ruling majority is enjoying some 63% of the seats in the parliament and 67, 68 of the opinion polls consensus rate. So other thing is that you like or not, but stability in the parliament is for sure. Second point, since I'm more security oriented than Vice President Dombrovskis, who is an economist, I will make 3 concrete examples why Europe shouldn't be taken for granted. So I would explain to somebody who is reluctant why to support Europe, highlighting the cost of not having Europe in some field. 3 examples. Custom controls reintroduction. Would you like to run the risk to have at the borders custom controls and paying the fees? First, you take for granted they no longer exist, but they could be one day in the nightmare event reintroduced. Second example, you have now, I'm a judge in the Supreme Court of Italy now, we have direct access to security data of a foreign state on tracking of a terrorist. Could you afford giving up that fantastic possibility for we, the investigators, the prosecutors, the judges? That is thanks for Europe. Arrest warrant, European arrest warrant. I can issue an arrest warrant to get a person who is trying to escape in Latvia and get him in prison in Italy 10 days later instead of rogatory. This is thanks to Europe. And final example, entry-exit biometric data register for all those who enter Europe for a foreign state. Is that something we need or not? So all those examples could explain why, as I said at the very beginning, Europe is still the best possible construction, although I'm very critical vis-à-vis some, I would say, missing points, missing challenges, and some failures.
Well, I think almost everyone can see the logic in what you're arguing about why Europe could or should be the best construction. The question is whether we think we can actually deliver that or not. Monsieur Val, I'm going to turn to former Prime Minister Tony Blair and Carl Bildt in a moment. Before I do, Monsieur Val.
Je vais faire une réponse d'abord convenue et convenable. Je pourrais dire que l'Europe doit se donner des priorités.
You know, Europe needs to identify its priorities. I think at least 3 priorities of this kind. That's the mass investments, and that was done thanks to the European Commission, Mr. Juncker. We need to invest into new technologies, environmental transformations, and I'm confident that also we need that Europe and European countries invest into fight against poverty. Another priority for both the EU and member states is the fight against terrorism. Further development of security, border security, and there were times I was Minister of Interior, know what I'm talking about. Point number 3, for Europe, a very important path of development is related to Africa and Mediterranean region, because the population of Africa is growing continuously. I'd like to answer a journalist who is a Eurosceptic. So what's the difference between the Eurosceptics as our esteemed journalists on one hand and those who want to destroy Europe, or populists, and us? The difference is that we are polite. We forgot about the right way of doing politics. We forgot about history, because now it's very important to protect the model of the single construct, the federation of the nations. Such countries as United Kingdom, Spain, France, Portugal, which had dozens of years of wars and finally managed to achieve democracy and development. That's what our final situation is. That's what we did. And now, with all my respect, I have a lot of respect for you, but we just left Eurosceptics, to express their opinions. We are too polite, these are key debates where we need to decisively defend our position. How could you say that we couldn't handle the financial crisis while such basic leaders of Europe, Troscan, Angela Merkel, who actually managed Mr. Sarkozy, in spite of serious consequences even for their perception by the public, managed to counter this crisis, to undertake responsibilities during the migration crisis in particular. They undertook responsibility with regard to Syria when the locals decided not to fight the regime. We undertook responsibility for fighting against terrorism at Mali. So I disagree with your criticism. We are not talking just about the future of Europe, but about the future of democracy. And now there are large discussions in both the United States and Europe concerning the democracy. The fact that what we are discussing now in Europe is actually the key historic matter. It's very symbolic that 2 days ago the European Parliament voted and the European People's Party undertook responsibility to incentivize the sanctions against Hungary. That's a really historic voting. I am not the Prime Minister anymore, but if our American friends do not hear us, they now continue talking to each other. I want to remind them that now the key point is the democracy. I want to recall the book, The People Against Democracy, and I think one of the solutions is suggested by Europe. We should never lose identity of any of our countries. Italy, France, England, they need to stay what they are, but to remain what they are. But we need to combine the experience of each country with love to Europe. These two can coexist, but we need to fight against Eurosceptics and populists. And I like somebody to dare to say that Great Britain or United Kingdom feels better with Brexit. I want to hear about the benefits. She's now just going out of the history. That was the United Kingdom of Tony Blair. Was not Great Britain, not Churchill anymore. It was number 3 security structure in Europe, and in front of challenges that we have from China and Putin's Russia, leave Europe, and I think that's exactly the consequence of the work of the populists.
Sorry?
May I respond briefly?
You certainly can, if you'd like to respond in French. If not, I'm going to ask former Prime Minister Blair to respond, but briefly.
Before we go to Tony Blair, let me explain something. I made speeches just like that during the Brexit referendum campaign because I was on the side of Remain. And I opposed Brexit. So I've made speeches just like that.
I don't think it's quite the same passion, Neil.
And those speeches did not work. And the reason that they did not work is that they have lost credibility over time. And I think the great problem that your president faces is that good though his speeches are, and good though your speech was, it is less and less credible to ordinary people in European countries because they say to themselves, you haven't dealt with the migration crisis. You messed up the way that you handled the financial crisis. And in Italy, growth is barely perceptible. If it's 1%, that's doing well. So I have to tell you, enthusiasts for Europe, this rhetoric has lost its credibility outside rooms like this. In the pubs of provincial England and I'm afraid it's true in provincial France, and it's certainly true in provincial Italy, this all sounds like bullshit now. You'll have to come up with something better next year, or believe me, you will lose, and the populists will gain, and they will gain because their rhetoric has become more credible. Even in Scandinavia, which we always thought was the heartland of Europhilia, quietly, the borders are being restored. The Danes, who nobody thinks of as dreadful populists, have restored the border between themselves and their neighbors. So let's not kid ourselves, ladies and gentlemen. This rhetoric was great 15 years ago, but in 2018, it has lost its power to convince ordinary people.
Okay, Signor Frandini or Monsieur Val?
Well,
show us how you convince ordinary people to believe this.
Well, I know perfectly that in a province of northeast of Italy, this kind of rhetoric lost credibility. I'm aware. But if I go straight to those people in Treviso and I explain, people, look, guys, you are running the risk of a terrorist coming to kill some of you or to commit a suicide bombing attack in a church. Would you like to have the instrument to prevent such kind of crime by having full access to data and criminals all across Europe or not? So I understand your point, but my answer is pragmatic approach. What is your right to be protected? What is the slogan of the Austrian presidency of EU? European protecting people. The only way to persuade reluctant people is that something in Europe that nobody else can offer to you. This is my only way to explain. Manuel is a pure politician. I'm just a judge. But I try to explain to those that are not convinced, it is your advantage to believe in the European Common Security Project. It is your advantage for your province, for your factory, for your family security. This is my only answer. Otherwise, if you compete on rhetoric, I lose. I'm aware. I lose with those that are much better than me on rhetoric. But if I put on the table, do you want to have no register for those entering the European territory, no common protection of our borders, everyone in my country will say, we want more, more. And who else, if not Europe, can guarantee border protection of all the external borders? So I'm a bit more pragmatic than rhetoric.
But Monsieur Frantini, Prime Minister Blair, former Prime Minister Blair, did indeed try very hard to tell the British public that, using those pragmatic arguments, he didn't quite talk with quite the same flowery passion as Monsieur Val, but he still tried to argue and persuade the British public. And you lost. I would argue that was a tragedy. Do you think there is any way to ever persuade the British public to believe in the European Union again, to reverse Brexit? Can you ever reverse Brexit? And if not, what will that mean for the UK?
Yes, we can.
Yes to which? Yes?
Yes, we can reverse it. And yes, we should. I don't dispute at all that Europe has got huge challenges. It's got the challenges of migration, which it hasn't handled well. Individual economies have got structural challenges, which they haven't always handled well. The Eurozone has been through a crisis, is absolutely true. But I make you this prediction here and now, and in 5 years' time we can see whether it's correct or not. Europe will survive, Europe will prosper, and Britain will regret Brexit if it does it, which I hope it doesn't. And the reason is very, very simple. All of the criticisms of Europe are true, but here's the difference in the way that people look at it in America and look at it here. Niall's actually absolutely right. There are lots of British people, and I find this echoed in America a lot of the time, who say, Europe's a failed project, you can't put these nations together, it's all going to collapse. By the way, they said that from the beginning about the European Union. I'm afraid it's been a constant British delusion that Europe is not going to succeed and it's all going to collapse. And it hasn't. And the reasons are very, very simple. The rationale for Europe after the Second World War was peace. And when people ask what Europe has achieved, well, after centuries of war, it's at 60 years of peace. That is quite a significant achievement. Talk to the countries in Eastern Europe today and ask them if Europe hasn't delivered for them. Of course it has. But the rationale for Europe today is actually stronger. It's power. By the middle of this century, you're going to have three giants. You're going to have America, China, and probably India. Those giants are going to be so much larger than other countries that if you're a medium-sized country, like Germany, like Italy, like Britain, like France, you're going to need to stand together collectively to achieve what you cannot do alone. And so the rationale for Europe today is not peace, it's power. And that rationale is going to keep Europe together, whatever its strains and stresses. And the truth of the matter is, of course, Europe's got challenges and it's going to have to reform and change. But I also was in Italy last week, and I met Mr. Salvini. But for all the rhetoric, Italy's not going to leave Europe. Italy's not going to leave the euro. Greece didn't leave the euro despite all the difficulties it had. And I just say this to you, in the world that's developing, it's important that countries that share democratic values stay together. Brexit is bad for Britain. It's also bad for Europe. It's going to pull out a major economy. It's going to pull out a large democracy, a big political player, at the very moment when Europe needs to stand together. So I've no doubt at all that there will be many changes and difficulties, but I've no doubt either that Europe would be better if Britain remained, and Britain would be better and stronger if it decided in a fresh vote, which it should have, to stay within the European family of nations. So,
but Prime Minister, but
that's my
how do you manage to change the path in the UK? I mean, there's no mechanism for the UK to reverse its decision on Brexit at the moment, is there?
There's no majority in Parliament, in my view, for the Prime Minister's proposition. In fact, there's no majority in Parliament for any proposition on Brexit. And I only say this about the credibility. Yes, it's true, we lost the referendum. But there's also credibility, I think, now for those people who supported Brexit. I mean, those people who supported Brexit, our currency is down, what, 15%? We were the fastest growing economy in the G7, we're the slowest. We were promised we'd get £350 million a week extra of the health service, and we haven't got it.
Yeah.
So if we hit paralysis in Parliament, the sensible thing, given all that we've learned in these negotiations over the last 2 years, is to put it back to the people and ask them whether they want to proceed or not in the light of
on that point, Monsieur Val, Signor Frantini, do you think that the European Union would actually have Britain back?
By the way, can I just correct you? It's not a question of that. If we revoke this before the end of March 2019, we have a right to stay.
Well, do you think the European Union would welcome Britain remaining inside after all of this? Or is it too late? Is it too late? Has Britain gone?
A very significant silence.
Well, I will try to break this silence to say for the European Commission, which we have always emphasized that, well, we respect the outcome of a referendum, but we regret it. And of course, nobody in EU is pushing UK out of the EU. We think that this process seems to be on track, well, how you say, within UK itself, but don't get it wrong. It's not that EU would now be pushing UK out, no.
Well, I have no doubts. We'd like to have very much to have back Britain within EU. It has been from the very beginning one of the countries encouraging to remain solution. But also I have to recognize there has been some mistakes made by European institutions. During the electoral campaign, Tony remembers, those even threatening the British voters that were for Brexit. You shouldn't, it will be a problem. People don't like at all others dictating what you should do, you shouldn't do. It happens also to Italy. Every time somebody wants to teach a lesson to the Italian voters, the voters will react in the opposite way. And frankly speaking, there were some mistakes at the very beginning of the campaign. There should have been abstention, including the President of the United States, say, oh, that would be a nightmare if the Brits will vote for Brexit. It was wrong, in my opinion. Let the voters decide freely.
Il n'y a ni rhétorique, ni silence. Il y a des convictions. Et défendre l'Union européenne, Tony, défendre la raison et la démocratie, défendre le fait que la Grande-Bretagne devrait rester dans l'Union européenne, c'est difficile. Parce que vous avez raison sur un point. C'est la crise de confiance dans nos démocraties. Mais pas seulement dans nos pays, mais dans toutes les démocraties. Et c'est vrai aux États-Unis, par exemple. Il y a une crise de confiance profonde de la démocratie liée à la globalisation, liée aux réseaux sociaux, liée à la perte, à la chute des grandes idéologies, liée au monde dans lequel nous sommes. Et ici en Ukraine, on le sait encore mieux, le monde a changé depuis 1989. Oui, ça on a compris. Globalisation, chute du mur de Berlin, du monde construit à Yalta, nouvelle économie, etc. Et populisme. Mais ce n'est pas de la rhétorique, c'est de la conviction. Je pense que les grands partis, les grands leaders, les politiques que nous sommes, nous n'avons pas parlé au cœur des citoyens. Nous avons parlé chiffres, nous avons parlé économie. Et les populistes savent parler au cœur et à la peur que les gens expriment quant à l'avenir. Nous sommes dans un moment où en plus les gens pensent que leurs enfants vont vivre moins bien qu'eux. Et donc du coup on est dans des sociétés de repli. On se replie vers le passé qui était mieux. Vous allez demander aux gens en Ukraine si le passé c'était mieux avant. Ou alors sur leur propre identité qu'ils pensent, parfois à juste titre, menacée.
And sometimes they do think that there is a threat to their lives. I'm a realist, and I don't want anyone to teach me on security and migration. I myself was the first in the front line to fight against terrorism, and I was criticizing Merkel when she opened the borders. I said, be cautious, these are not coordinated actions, and we are risking the worst things. The populists may grow as a result of this, and I do understand the nobility of Germans and their kind heart, but I criticize them. But I still can understand why they did it. But we need to speak about the possibilities. I think that the path which isolates every country, as Tony Blair said, that there will be 3 big leaders, but when we're talking about migration crisis, I'm going to stand for these convictions. I'm not going to stand for rhetorics. I will always say what is useful for European Union.
Full of strong feelings. I'm going to give very quickly for a couple of minutes to Carl Bildt from Sweden, and then we're going to have to wrap up. So the Swedes get the last vote, the last voice.
There's got to be a sort of a Viking voice in this debate. let me put out one fact that hasn't been mentioned. If you look at opinion polls throughout Europe in the last 1 or 2 years, there's been a significant rise in public opinion support for the European Union. A significant rise. Why is that? Is it because people have suddenly fallen in love with Jean-Claude Juncker or Brussels? I think that is, sorry to say, slightly unlikely. I think the reason for this significant rise in the support for the European Union is what I call the BTP effect that we've seen. And the BTP effect in public opinion is, of course, Putin, Trump, and Brexit. People understand that we are living in a vastly more complicated world. And if you look at this world, we got a regionally revisionist Russia. People are scared of that. We have a globally disruptive United States that is deeply unsettling. We got an increasingly assertive China that is also impacting upon us. Add to that a number of meltdowns in the Middle East, which is neighborhood of Europe, not the neighborhood of the United States, the neighborhood of Europe. We got the demographic explosion in Africa, another neighborhood, and we got a vast digital transformation. And if I might take issue with Tony Blair on only one point, Tony said that this is a complicated issue for medium-sized countries, and he mentioned a couple of them. I would say none of the small countries of Europe, like the United Kingdom, like France, like Germany, like Italy, like Latvia, like Sweden, can deal with this on our own. And to some extent, I think our electorates are wiser than us. They understand we can't do it on our own, we need to do it together. Where I think we need to adjust, to go to the distinguished professor, which I to some extent agree with, I think the rhetoric of the past doesn't really work any longer. We can make all of these speeches, I've done too many of them, on reconciliation between France and Germany. I will continue to do them, but it doesn't cut any ice any longer with the new generation. And although we have to look at the immense historical achievement, just think of where we are. Where are we? We are not by the river Rhine. We are not by the river Danube. We are by the river Dnieper, deep in Eastern Orthodox Europe. Who 25 years ago would have believed that we would be sitting in a pro-European capital by the Dnieper? No one would have believed that. That's the soft power of Europe. Right. But we need to bring... I would still say that the Europe of dreams is to a certain extent gone. Well, but the Europe of necessity is there. And we need to bring the Europe of necessity to our electorates. I think they understand it to some extent better than we do. But that requires a number of things. Breaking the bubble of Brussels, bringing Europe back from Brussels to our different national electorates. And there I think different national politicians have not been as effective as we should have been. That lesson we need to learn.
Right. Well, thank you. That is a fantastic way to end, with an optimistic point about where we are sitting today. So thank you all very much indeed. Who would have guessed a few years ago that this will be talking about this today? That indeed is a sign of the potential for change and optimism. Thank you. And enjoy your desserts.
Before we wrap, can I announce, and before you applaud, hold your applause, that the next event in our conference begins very shortly indeed in the conference hall, where we shall hear the President of Estonia. Please don't linger at the table, but proceed swiftly to the conference hall for the next event. And with that, I think we can conclude this session. Please join me in giving our panelists a warm round of applause.